I'm Eric Chemi, and this is Politely Pushy. Tom Carpenter, thanks for joining me today. I'm excited to do this because you're a principal at Bospar. You've been there from the beginning. I see you in Zooms working your magic with other clients. I see you just being such an amazing leader of this company. And everyone always says, oh, if there's a crisis, you got to talk to Tom. Oh, crisis communications, you got to talk to Tom. So here we are today talking about crisis communications. I'm talking to Tom. Tell me, why does everybody say that you are the expert at that?
Well, I invented the practice here at Bospar and have been working with several different clients from start to finish. So we've done crisis communications plans for companies from startups all the way through to public companies. So we've done tabletop exercises. We've done everything from A to Z. So hopefully we're the experts at it.
And I know from your background, because it's come up, it's on your LinkedIn, you used to work at a big law firm. So you've got this legal experience. Were you a lawyer? Were you doing communications? How did you get from law firm into tech PR?
I started out doing PR at Skadden Arps, and that is the world's fourth largest law firm. And so there they are very tight-lipped and buttoned up about the kind of PR that they do. And so I think that parlayed itself very well in terms of controlling crises for other tech companies.
And was it your job to focus on the law firms itself PR, or is it the clients that they were dealing with? But my guess there's a lot of secrets. There's a lot of stuff they don't want to talk about, or there's a lot of the PR work for a law firm. Let's make sure that this doesn't get publicized. Were you getting graded on how few stories were written about the firm?
Yeah, there are some things that they don't want publicized, but primarily the arm of PR for a global law firm is more interested in attracting top talent. So they want to bring in summer associates who will be successful, who are from the top of their class from the Ivy League universities, and who will go through the program successfully. So that was the main audience for what they were trying to do.
And today we had a whole list of questions. It was going to be all about crisis PR. We're going to talk about that. But this February 24th. So this is the first full day that we're seeing the Russia-Ukraine invasion, war, crisis, whatever you want to call it. This is a real true global crisis that's going on. From the perspective of geopolitics and all that, I don't think it's in our pay grade or our experience to get into so much of what's going on there. But I think about from a client's point of view, from a company's point of view, the business is still getting done in America as best as companies are trying to do business in America. This is a crisis situation, not of their own doing. This is a crisis out of their control, but business still has to get done. They're trying to get their word out. How do you advise clients? What kind of conversations have you been having this week to deal with a crisis that's happening in a way to every company in America right now? There's nothing they can do about it.
Yeah, and I don't think it's unlike evaluating any global event as they impact both your people and your company, right? So in this particular situation, I don't think you want to appear to be taking advantage of a crisis, particularly when people are likely to be hurt. But we do need to think about internal communications. Do we have people in the affected area? Do we need to do something to help them? And do we need to not just say, but demonstrate empathy for the situation? So, for instance, when another global event happened, the Texas abortion ban, we took action. We offered a program for our folks to leave Texas if they needed to or wanted to. And I think that you think of any global event like that. How does it impact your people first? What can you do that's tangibly helpful? And then you think about your company. Will it be more difficult to provide your services? And can you say something or provide data that helps the situation in some small way? If not, maybe you want to stay out of it. When the Texas power grid went down, when there was a global chip shortage, our client Supply Frame, for instance, was able to provide data on where hardware manufacturers could look to help keep the supply chain moving. So we thought, gosh, that's a helpful thing we can do in this particular situation. So then it makes sense for us to get involved. But otherwise, you stay out of that and you focus on what you're good at.
So what you're good at is PR, specifically for tech companies for the most part. What are the mistakes typically that companies make when it comes to crisis communications? I guess I'll rephrase now back to when they're the ones having the crisis. The crisis is, let's say, of their own doing as it relates to their company. there are a lot of companies, they say too much. There are companies they don't say enough. There's some that hope the news cycle will move on. Then they say the wrong thing and it creates another news cycle. I'm sure you've seen all of this in your career. What is your typical advice to companies to say, all right, at least don't make this one mistake?
There's a few things that you could do wrong when facing a crisis. I think we've seen examples of that around the world. But the first thing I would say is that companies need to be prepared. Have you identified the types of crises that could be anticipated in advance, right? So if you're a security company, maybe you've thought about the potential for a data breach. Maybe you've thought about the potential for a technology problem, or maybe there's something that's involving of workplace harassment or violence that goes viral on social media. There's a variety of things that you need to think about in advance, and then you need to think about it in terms of what's most likely to happen, and if that thing does happen, what is the thing that's going to have the most impact on our business. So when we look at that, we think, gosh, we need to have some sort of advanced reactionary statements, some thoughts on that, so that we feel comfortable that we have an approach. And then another thing that is interesting, I think, that I see quite often is that CEOs will declare a crisis that may not need to be a crisis. And so a good example of that, I think, is a company that comes to mind. They had a technology partner involved in a lawsuit, and the lawsuit didn't relate to them at all. They had nothing to do with it, but the CEO was insistent on putting out a press release making clear that they had nothing to do with it, which I thought was really interesting because, of course, then they're directly tying themselves to it. They would likely get involved in news stories that are covering it. And we thought, a better approach would be a simple, super boring holding statement to give to any inquiring media about it, that we're not involved, we're not part of the news. And so any good reporter would see that and say, oh, okay, well, then there's nothing to see here, nothing to report. So I think there's a tendency to take action when sometimes action is not necessary. And then if it is a crisis, I think there is a lot to think about in terms of, do we take action or do we wait and see and take that approach? So think about, does it already have media or social media traction, or does it have the appeal to get there? Would the crisis affect any of our customers in any kind of meaningful way? Could it cause harm to an employee? Will it have any kind of impact on the business? If any of those things are true, then yes, we would definitely want to sort of formally declare a crisis, bring in all the right people who should be involved. And we need to think about that in advance too, because if it is a workplace violence issue, we want the HR folks involved, and then they should know in advance that they're part of that team if that thing does happen, versus a technology problem that's impacting customers and customers are complaining. We need those engineers ready to go and in place. And I guess, finally, the, kind of big sort of things that we see that companies make mistakes on is just transparency. Immediately
like they're too transparent. They're too transparent, or they're not transparent enough when you say the mistake is transparency.
The issue is that they don't want to be transparent. They're not transparent enough. And there's also a hesitation when they don't have all the facts, right? So the idea is that maybe you don't have all of the facts yet, but you do want to immediately acknowledge that the crisis is taking place, so long as it's an obvious, evident, crisis that people can already see. Silence is not good. Immediately acknowledge the crisis, and then say who you're working with to fix it. Maybe it's a regulatory authority that you're cooperating with, or a third-party forensics team that we're working with. Just keep all stakeholders informed that the fix is underway, when it can be inspected, and what you're doing as you're doing it. And that makes people feel very comfortable. And if you've got Slack and Slack goes down for a day, they don't ignore it. They tell you immediately what they think happened. Maybe it was a cyber attack. Here's what they're doing to fix it, and here's when you can expect it to be back up and running. And that keeps folks happy and keeps the media from turning it into something that sounds more nefarious than it needs to be.
Is there some value in the idea that there is so much news these days? Everyone is so distracted. There's so many platforms. There's social media. Like, there's just such a short attention span that every story goes away. Like, if you just did nothing, I mean, I know you just talked a little bit about that, but as a default, if you had to start from some baseline, is the baseline, okay, just say nothing because like there will be something else of someone else's problem 2 days from now and all the reporters will move on. Is that just too naive?
Well, I don't know if it's a matter of distraction from the story. I think it's more a matter of, will this index in Google, will it be findable to potential customers? What is it that has been said? Is it coming from a publication that has relatively low reach, or has it been something that's been reported in CNN? And so all those things are going to be big factors. But if we don't expect others to pick up a story, if it's in a relatively smaller publication, I think it's oftentimes in a company's interest to let it grow some moss. But at the same time, watch it carefully, follow social media, follow the regular media, making sure that if there is any more mention of this, that we have reactionary statements and a backup plan. But yeah, sometimes it is appropriate to let something kind of go away.
What about the avalanche of social media? I think about cancel culture right now. When you're on the wrong side of something and you've got millions of tweets coming at you, all right, this person needs to be fired, or we're all going to boycott this company. It's so big. There's no amount of reporters that you're going to be able to call to try to offset that. What does a company do? Right? They're just getting punched every single second now.
Right. And you can't respond to all of those punches. I think that when I'm having a conversation with someone about something like that, the first thing that you would say is don't panic. These comments are going to get made, and that you just put out the information that you have as you have it, and that we are taking responsible action to cure whatever the ill is. And so if it's a technology issue, we're keeping you informed as to the fix. If it's something that is a little bit more interesting to the media, or perhaps even salacious, there's been some kind of HR problem, then we talk about how we're investigating it, and that we're respecting the privacy of the folks involved, but we'll let everyone know once this has been taken care of.
What about long-term reporter relationships? How important are those when it comes to a crisis? Because you're hoping, hey, we've got a good relationship with these people. They trust us. We've done work with them. We've helped them out with stories. We've been a good resource to these reporters. I'm hoping that they will let us say our side of the story. I'm hoping that goodwill is going to be useful, because my guess is you don't want to start trying to make relationships with new reporters at the point of the crisis, because there is no rapport, there's no relationship. They don't trust you. They don't care what you have to say at that point.
Yeah, that's right. And I think that those relationships are very important. But I also think that any fair-minded journalist will quickly correct any inaccuracies. It helps to have a sympathetic ear. It helps to be able to reach out and say, oh, hey, I know you're obligated to cover this, or you already have. And I want to make sure that you have everything correct when you do publish it. And then it can also help steer the article toward covering whatever the solutions-oriented approach is. And it's not likely to contain broad coverage of the crisis if it's a legitimate story. So I don't think there's really any, ask there for them to pull the article or anything like that. If it's legitimate, it's legitimate. But we just want to make sure that the company gets their message out, and certainly those relationships help.
You mentioned Google earlier, and I think about, yeah, that's a different dynamic than what would have happened 20 years ago. How important is Google in all of these thought-making process, the decision-making process, the what's going to be on that first page versus what's not going to be on that first page? How important is that a top 5 factor in terms of how you make decisions in crisis comms?
Yeah, sometimes. I mean, the idea is that maybe something doesn't go viral in the media. Maybe it doesn't blow up on social media, but it is readily findable because it is indexed on Google search or any other search engine. And what we want to do is have some counter programming there. So if there's a crisis that is quite predictable, maybe it's a platform that allows for communication, and people are misusing that in some way in some other country to do something nefarious. I think in that particular situation, that's a very predictable crisis. What we would recommend is putting out a blog post or putting out some kind of statement on how we are combating the use of our platform, what our terms of service are, that we condemn it, that we've addressed it. And that way, when there is something that comes up, maybe a little story gets written and it is indexed in Google, a potential customer asks a question about it, or a reporter does, we can always point to the fact that we've already addressed this and therefore it's a non-issue. And sometimes you want to be a little bit aggressive and get ahead of things that way.
It's that balance. I think that's what I'm trying to get. It's like, I'd love to hear some case studies, right? Because sometimes it sounds like you want to be aggressive. Other times, like with that one company, your advice was, no, you don't need to insert yourself into the story by trying to explain that you're not part of the story. That's too aggressive. What are some case studies that you use as teaching examples to some of your younger colleagues, people in the industry? You don't have to give names depending on who it is, but I would just be curious some of the nuts and bolts of the mechanics of how a certain crisis developed and how it was resolved.
I mean, there are a couple of famous examples that we can name.
I mean the ones like you've worked on. I'm curious, like the Tom Carpenter crises examples. If you can name them, even better.
Well, I would not like to, because I don't think clients necessarily want to publicize their case studies of having had a crisis and fixed it. But we did have a client who has a very big impact on how the internet functions. And that was sort of a little known thing and not necessarily a known name when they first came to us. And what was interesting about the crisis was that they had an outage. And what we thought was, let's do our typical playbook when something like that happens. We want to make sure that we are completely transparent about what has happened. We communicated early and often, but it had the interesting impact of widening the public knowledge about what their service is, because several of their customers were impacted as well. And so they had minimal outages. And so the news of the day was, gosh, these websites have gone down temporarily. What happened? And then we had the opportunity to tell the story about how most of the time we are making the internet better.
There's the phrase, don't let a good crisis go to waste. Is there a little bit of that ethos from your perspective, or is it not that? Is this typically much more about being on defense? The example you gave certainly had a little bit of some offense to it. Hey, we'll take advantage of this and actually try to build a positive spin for our brand. Is that an exception? Is it typically much more about just let's play defense, let's try not to lose points here and move on to fight another day?
Yeah, it really depends, of course. If we're talking about a technology outage, no one's been hurt. Maybe some people have been delayed a bit in communicating on a website, or maybe the global business slowed down for a minute. In that case, we would put out all of the information about what we're doing to make it better. But then that's also an opportunity to talk about, all of our reach into different companies and different industries. But of course, if you've got something that is more of a crisis where someone could get hurt or someone has been hurt, you don't want to appear to be ambulance chasing. And in that particular scenario, you just want to say, hey, here's what we're doing, and we're taking care of our people, and we've taken these actions. And if people really respect the actions that you've taken, then that story gets told. But in that particular situation, I don't think you're thinking about, gosh, this is a real positive story for us. You're thinking, let's do the right thing.
What have you taken away from your law firm experience? Because most people who are in your shoes right now, they don't have that experience of working in that industry, working in the law firm, like working at a big law firm at Skadden, working in the legal industry, very sensitive, very high stakes. That's a major global firm. What are some unique lessons that you bring to the table because you had that experience earlier in your career?
Yeah, well, I think you always want to be thinking about any kind of statement that you make and how that will impact the client's ability to gain new customers in the future. You're wanting to think about the second and third order effects of any kind of communications policy. So if we go out with something, we want to make sure that we are doing it in a way that's positive. We sometimes can name names, but only if it is what those companies did right, not necessarily that, we're pointing any fingers or we're doing any kind of, these people were at fault kind of story. I think it's more wanting to make sure that we're playing nice in the sandbox, but also being very honest.
I remember a story once. I was in a room with a CEO of a cruise line company, and he said, whenever there's a classic predictable cruise line, the virus outbreaks, everybody gets sick, the boat is stuck on shore, stuck offshore, that kind of thing, it hurts the whole industry. Even though it's his competitor, it hurts all of them because people, general public, they don't really keep track. All we hear is we see on the news, we just see a cruise liner and we see the headlines, cruise liner stuck. So it hurts all of them. So now if it's your competitor, you'd think there's an opportunity. Hey, well, they're bad, we're good, we take market share, but no, you actually all lose. That's another type of crisis that an entire industry suffers. So what's your advice for companies like that? I'm sure you've dealt with something like that where it's our competitor has this issue, but it makes us all look bad. So what does a company do in that situation?
Yeah, and I think you've outlined it. I mean, the messaging there is more of an industry-wide message, and of course, the cruise industry is is the perfect example because right now they put out messaging about all of the different safety protocols they have in place. There is COVID testing in advance. There's COVID testing upon boarding, that kind of thing, and then you put out messaging that says, cruising is the one way to travel that is most safe. There are not these kinds of precautions taking place on airplanes or in other modes of transportation. And so you have a more industry focused message. And in some cases, you even do partnerships within the industry. So there's possibility to do that with crises, but there's also possibility to do that where there's opportunity to affect good change on the world. So for one good example, I think was when we did do the Don't Mess with Texas campaign, or that We Mess with Texas campaign when Texas passed their abortion ban. We thought, let's take this beyond just helping our own employees. Let's try to bring the industry together for a message that all of us can get behind. And so we held virtual job fairs with many different PR firms and partners with agreed upon messaging that we wanted to put out into the world. And I think we had a lot of good change that we saw as a result of it.
You mentioned COVID. It brings me to an obvious question. The last couple of years have been a very difficult time for a lot of companies trying to get their message out. A lot of crises when it comes to health and employees, supply chain, vaccine mandates. Oh my gosh, you name it. Are there companies that stand out to you from afar? You look at them and you're not like, hey, these guys are doing a great job. These particular individuals or these firms have done a good job with the crises that they've faced. Are there certain PR professionals or certain companies that you look to as examples of, I wish I was that good. I wish I had come up with the idea that they did.
I think that those people who are on the front lines and who can be helpful in some way have done a really good job of promoting their involvement. I think Walgreens and CVS and the folks who have been helping provide vaccines have done a very good job of showing what they are doing to make things convenient and easy for folks. I think those are just sort of obvious, great examples. I don't know that anyone has done anything particularly creative, but I think that when you can get in front of it and explain how you're helping or providing a resource, that's what you want to do. And that's been our kind of thought process throughout the entire time. Is early on, we talked to every single client we had about internal communications. What should you be doing to help your folks? How should you be enhancing your sick leave policy for them? But then also, what kind of message can you put out there that is not taking advantage of a pandemic, but is more, hey, we have this some small way of helping or providing information or, providing additional masks for people when that was a big deal. We took on a client we wouldn't normally take on called Action PPE to further a cause. We thought that's a really good opportunity to do some great PR to get personal protective equipment out to rural areas, because at the time the government and hospital systems were not doing a great job of providing that kind of access. And we thought, here's a small way we can help. Here's something we can do. So I think there's a lot to say about changes we've had to make throughout COVID. And I think the really good examples are just companies like that made a difference and really tried to see a small problem where we could help.
Are there from afar the opposite, like companies that you've seen respond to a crisis but didn't do a good job, and then there was backlash and then it got worse? And I'm sure when you're watching the news and you're seeing these things happen, you sort of roll your eyes like, I wouldn't have done that. And now they're facing the consequences. What are some, and again, you don't have to name names, but what are some mistakes that you've seen that just in the last couple of years that just stick out to you, like, oh, I wish I had been able to give them some counsel because I would have taken them in a different direction?
Yeah, I think there's been some defensiveness around company policies when it comes to masking. Some of the rideshare apps have not necessarily communicated perfectly throughout the pandemic about how best to treat drivers. There have been incidents there where I kind of thought, you're in the middle of something where you need to show support for your workers, but you also need to show empathy for the writers. And I saw a lot of that kind of playing out, where we thought a simpler, clearer, easier to understand policy that was nationwide would have been a better approach.
It's funny you mentioned the ride share companies. That was a category that I was thinking about in my head, because I feel like they just in general have a lot of crises to deal with. Like there's just
Mhm.
so much difficulty to run that business. And I'm glad that I don't work at one of those companies, because I don't know how I would deal, because it sounds like every day they have something. And I imagine that you're probably happy you don't have to work there too. I'm curious though, the process, how much of it is decision by committee, where there's groupthink, where it's okay, we've got the executives at the C level, we've got the communications folks in house, we've got an external PR agency, maybe there's a consultant. When there's a crisis, are there sometimes too many voices in the room, and you end up getting this committee based decision that's too neutralized and maybe not aggressive enough, not defensive enough? I'm sure you've seen situations like that.
Yeah, and that's where I think the what we would call a tabletop exercise is so important, and having a plan in place in advance, because what you do is you decide who the core team should be on any crisis. And so at a smaller company, or really any company, maybe it's the CEO, maybe it is, three top executives who need to be involved. And if we've declared that this is indeed a crisis, it is worthy of their time, we're going to have them in the room. And then we have a list of folks that we're also going to bring in if it is relevant to their area of expertise. And so, as I mentioned earlier, maybe that's an HR person, or maybe it's a technical person, or whatnot. And then we end up with maybe 3-4 people, and then we've got a third party like ourselves involved. I don't think we've seen a lot of watering down. What typically takes place is we will discuss it, we get everybody's opinion, and then we make a recommendation from our side, and that usually involves writing a holding statement in case we need it if things get very big in the media, or if situation gets worse, we'll draft that. Quick approvals. I think we do a pretty good job of the statement ending up being exactly what we need it to be, because it has to be. You can't put out statements that are done by committee and watered down. And I think that cuts across almost everything we do in terms of writing press releases and blog posts and really any piece of content.
Are there ever strategy decisions in terms of, okay, some people in the room want to take a certain tack, other people in the room want to go a different tack? We can't do both. We have to pick one. We're not going to agree unanimously. So some people are going to agree, some people aren't. And you just have to go with something and hope, okay, well, I don't agree with this, but I'm going to hope that what you do is right. That I'm sure that creates some awkwardness in terms of, well, it didn't work out the way we wanted. We should have gone the other way, but now we can't go back. What are situations like that? How does that work?
Yeah, and I'm not afraid to confront a CEO who is bullish about doing something that we think might not be in their best interest. We had a client who saw something interesting taking place, and it was a CEO of another company talking about a topic that he really wanted to own, but it was also a significantly smaller company, and it was a little bit off the rails in terms of the kinds of tweets and information that CEO was putting out. And so he had wanted to move forward with tagging that, putting himself and the company into that conversation. And we thought, this is really an opportunity for us to say, hey, we don't do this often, but in this particular situation, here are the reasons why we believe that might be a bad instinct. And here's what we recommend doing instead. You can build your profile in a number of different ways. We want to be thought leaders, not thought followers. And so in that particular situation, just had to have a heart to heart.
A heart to heart. I like the way you put it. And then the final question before you go. when you see the impact of the work you do for a lot of these companies and you realize the amount of money that's at stake, do you ever think, I'm not charging enough for these crisis comms. I'm getting paid X, but the impact is 1,000 times X. Do you ever think about like what is really the value here? And they're getting kind of a good deal out of all this.
Yeah, I do have thoughts about that, just because I know that a lot of agencies will charge a very, very large premium if there is ever a crisis. And I don't ever want to, I don't want us to ever come off as taking advantage of a crisis like that, even among our own clients. And so I feel pretty strongly that when something happens and maybe we're running hot that month, or, whatever the situation is, I think they should see us as partners who are willing to roll up the sleeves immediately and get involved, because there's just no time to think about, gosh, we're really spending a lot of time on this on behalf of this one client who's having a crisis. I think the thought process really has to be, if this needs to be an all agency endeavor, because this is really a big deal, then let's bring all the king's horses and men to it.
Tom, fascinating conversation. I appreciate the time. Thanks for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you to my guest, and thanks for listening. Subscribe to get the latest episodes each week, and we'll see you next time.